So now that you've decided what story you want to tell, you have to figure out how it's going to become a transmedia narrative. And that means that you'll need to gather what we call user requirements. It's the first stage in the interaction design process, which you'll remember from week 5. Gathering requirements is a 3-step process. So first, you have to make sure that you understand your goal. And this sounds easy, but it's really not. Because you really have to prioritize your goals and be able to explain your goal clearly. When I work with clients, a lot of times they want to accomplish a lot of things. They want their app to be on everyone's phone, but that's just not possible. It can't be for everybody. When you try to make something for everyone, you end up making something that nobody wants. When was the last time you bought a one-size-fits-all shirt, for example? Probably never, even though they do exist. Technically, it's possible to make something that lots and lots of people love, but no one wants to feel that they're buying a one-size-fits-all product. They want an experience that is more unique to them. So your transmedia narrative has to be obviously about one thing. From there, you want to understand your users. Who are they and what do they want? Are they looking to be entertained or are they looking to learn? Think about specific audiences at this point. It's not enough to say that your story, for example, is for college students. Is there a specific group of people who your story is for, who will latch on to your story? You have to be more specific than just a general notion of audience like college students. For example, you'll see in the Transmedia Narrative Project Explainer that I've provided to you that I always use the example of a transmedia narrative I always joke about making called Stop Mittens. Stop Mittens is the transmedia narrative that I would make if I were a student in this class, and it would be about a maniacal cat, Mittens, who seeks revenge upon the human race for having been forced to live in a cat shelter. The hero of the story is another cat who loves people and doesn't want to destroy them. It's basically the story of Magneto and Professor X, except with cats. Mittens is Magneto, for those of you who don't follow the X-Men world, and Magneto is the bad guy. I would build this story for the cat folks over on Reddit. It's something I could put on Little Bub's website. I know that the story is great for fans of famous internet cats like Little Bub and Chairman Meow and Grumpy Cat. It's a story that cat nerds on the internet would like. And that's pretty specific, a lot more specific of a target audience than, say, college students. So finally, after you've discovered and sort of determined who your audience is, you have to figure out how people are going to use your story. And not just how people in general, but how that audience is going to use your story, step by step. Where do they start? Is it a homepage that they find? Do they get an email? The I Love Bees story started with a URL in a movie trailer. From there, then what? What do they need? Videos, puzzles? We aren't going to get into that this week. Instead, you'll create storyboards next week that will show this step-by-step series of tasks. But it's good to understand what's on the horizon as you work toward creating your story. So this week, you're going to develop some usability goals. So going back to step 1, you have to figure out what your goals are. You're going to develop usability goals based on the goals that you learned about in week 5 in the interaction design lesson. And those are learnability, memorability, safety, efficiency, effectiveness, and utility. Also, I'm going to throw in satisfaction, even though your reading excluded it. Basically, you choose 1 or 2 of these usability goals that you think your entire story is really about. Is it an entertainment story that should provide satisfaction, or is it primarily an educational story about utility? The zombies ARG that you looked at in week 4 is a good example of a story with an overall usability goal of utility. That is, it's about helping freshmen who are new to a campus learn about what the library offers and how it's useful to them. Usefulness is utility. Next, you're going to figure out what your user experience goals are. what do you want the experience to be like? Is it entertaining, motivating, supporting of creativity? There's a list of words that describe user experiences similar to these ones in your reading from week 5, so check there if you get stuck. The next step is to gather requirements that you need to meet in order to both meet your usability and UX goals. So what are requirements? Well, they are statements about what your story needs to do or how it should perform. For example, if you have an ARG at some point, you have to have some part of your story, it could be a website or a YouTube video or whatever else you come up with, that establishes the alternate reality. Although requirements typically include what media helps the requirement to be achieved, at this stage in your project planning, you don't have to know exactly what that media is yet. You can establish the alternate reality in many ways in that last example, but your story isn't going to make sense if you skip this requirement. So for this week, you'll come up with the requirement. We need to establish the alternate reality. Next week, you'll come up with what media will help you do that. Your reading this week discusses functional and non-functional requirements, but we aren't going to get into those in this course. But it is helpful to know that requirements that are functional explain what the product should do. For example, if you want to make a tool to help students work in groups remotely, it's pretty important that there be some way for users to see each other's work. That's a description of what the product should do. It's also helpful to know that some requirements concern data. They're data requirements, or what needs to be shared. In the example of designing a tool to help students work in groups remotely, what kind of data needs to be shared? Text documents? Images? PowerPoints? What kinds of pieces of data will people want to share? Environmental requirements concern physical spaces, social environments, organizational restrictions, and technical restrictions. For example, a technical environment requirement for each of your narratives might be that it uses technology that already exists, like Wix, WordPress, Twitter, and so on, because probably none of you want to build websites and technologies for your story from scratch. Your requirements can be a mix of these different types. They should all move you toward your overall goal. So I need to be able to see that each requirement you list will make your story be the kind of thing you describe in the usability and user experience goals. So how do you come up with requirements? Well, we call this step gathering or establishing requirements. You have to figure out what you need to look at. Do you need to understand more about entertainment narratives, or do you need to understand more about online learning? Do you need to see what technical limitations you have, or are those not important? The answer to this depends on what your usability and user experience goals are. The other thing to remember about answering this question is that there are multiple ways to do it. There are a lot of wrong ways, but also some right ways. What you're going to do is look at sites that already exist and interview users as they use them to see if you can understand what makes the experience good to the user. But that's not the only way to investigate requirements. I want to talk to you briefly about some of the ways you can establish requirements, and then I'll get more detailed about how you're going to do it for this week's assignment. One way is to create personas. These are archetypes of the different kinds of people who will use what you make. You do this research by researching your users with demographic research, interviews, focus groups, and so on. You're trying to figure out who your users are, how proficient they are with computers, what they like and don't like. MailChimp has a great set of personas which they made into these cool posters. You can see that they have identified a few different archetypes or kinds of people who use MailChimp and given each of them a name. The receptionist, the PR manager, the developer, the studio consultant. Each persona, and the PR manager is one persona, the developer is another persona, tells the story of who that archetype is. What do they want? Why are they using MailChimp? You use these personas throughout your design process. If you get stuck at a step and you aren't sure, you have a decision to make. Let's say you're deciding whether the chat tool should have emojis or not. You look at these personas and try to figure out if these people would like emojis. Would they think it's silly or would they use them? Personas, so you're checking your decisions against the narratives of your users. Personas more typically look like this, with little mini narratives about the user archetype. There are many ways to capture user data to create personas, or even if you don't create personas, lots of ways to capture user data to figure out who your users and audience are. What I want to call out is contextual inquiry. This is a technique in which you basically go to work with the user, or if you're making something entertaining, you go play with them. You have the user walk you through what they do normally and take notes. So you're observing what the user does, when, and you're asking about why. You end up having seen exactly how users behave in their everyday life, as well as how they feel about it. However, you aren't really using any of these methods in this class. I wanted to talk about them so you would know what they are. For expediency, you're going to conduct sort of a lean, quick investigation into users. What you're going to do is, after establishing your usability and user experience goals, you'll choose 5 sites or stories that are like what you want to make for this project. It's okay if you overlap with your teammate, if, for example, you both choose the same 5. Then each of you will interview 5 to 10 users as they use at least one of those sites. You'll have them talk about their experience as they use the sites. You'll notice what they do with the sites, and when they do something interesting like let out a sigh, click the same button 10 times, or punch the computer out of frustration, you'll ask about it. So you're basically having the users think aloud or kind of narrate what they're doing. The goal here is to see what users like, what they don't like, where they get stuck, and what's important when they're using these sites that are like what you want to make. You can see an example of this in the Week 7 folder. If your story is educational, then look at good educational sites that accomplish the goal of teaching. But if your story is supposed to be educational but fun, like the Zombies ARG, then you need to look at online experiences that are both educational and fun in order to understand how they work and what makes them educational and fun at the same time. You might look at ARGs and transmedia narratives, or you might look at other sites that also happen to be what you're looking for, in this case, in my example, educational and fun, that may not be transmedia, and that's okay. If, for example, you want to create a story that uses real life history, you might look at sites that present history in a unique way and try to understand what people do and don't like about how history is presented on those sites. After each team member conducts interviews, you'll meet and come up with your list of requirements based on what you found. Your user requirements will eventually be put into a table like this one. However, this week, you don't yet know what media you want to use, so you're only going to fill out the left side of this table. You'll add in the media and descriptions next week. So what you're trying to do here is trying to understand what works about other sites with similar usability and user experience goals. You're trying to understand the user experience of those sites so you can capture the essence of what makes them good in your own transmedia narrative.